conference to discuss a significant setback in court to end gun violence. In another cruel and callous decision, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals has decided that those with domestic violence restraining orders against them may buy or continue to possess the very same firearms that possibly threatened their victims in the past. Survivors of domestic violence and victims of ongoing abuse will now be subjected to the horrifying notion that the next time they stop outside for coffee or go to the grocery store or take their child to the park, that a dangerous partner may put the life of themselves and their loved ones at risk. Can you imagine living under that constant terror? Gun violence happens every day in America. There have been over 60 mass shootings in the first month or so of the new year. 60 mass shootings. And our nation continues to watch in horror as individuals who should not have access to firearms wield these weapons of war and inflict pain and destruction on community after community, cutting beautiful lives short and devastating families in their wake. All too often, we learn after these shootings that there were warning signs. With domestic abusers, the warning signs are violent and they're visible. In many cases, family members and close relatives and associates have even petitioned law enforcement and the courts in an effort to implement restraining orders and restrict that individual's access to firearms before it's far too late. But despite these recent tragedies, the Fifth Circuit Court has recently vacated the conviction of a man who was legally deemed too dangerous to own a weapon, a man who was a subject of a civil protective order which banned him from harassing, stalking, or threatening his ex-girlfriend or partner or wife and their child, and ruled that the federal law which banned people subject to domestic violence restraining orders from owning guns was unconstitutional. If my son's murderer were to find his way out of prison, should he also have access to any weapon of war he should choose to wield? Is this really who we want to be here in the United States of America? A country where predators can purchase firearms as they please. We must move forward to save lives, not turn back the clock. These are common sense, bipartisan policies that a majority of the American people support. Policies that truly save lives, and the statistics show that. At this time, I would like to introduce my great friends and colleagues that have been standing on the front lines for safety, for gun violence prevention across America. At this time, I'd like to introduce the chairman of our Gun Violence Prevention Task Force from California's 4th Congressional District, Congressman Mike Thompson.
Lucy, thank you very much. Thanks for including me today, and thank you for doing what I think would be the unimaginable, being able to turn your tragedy into positive actions to make sure other families don't have to go through what you and your family went through. I can't imagine how difficult that is. And thanks to my other colleagues who are here for their commitment to end gun violence, and Debbie Dingell for your great work on domestic violence issues. We've got some great folks who work really hard to protect the American people. I read that 20 people per minute physically abuse an intimate partner. The the fact that domestic violence perpetrators are dangerous is why they're prohibited from owning firearms. They're a danger to someone else. And both states across the country as well as the federal government recognize this, and this prohibition has been in law. This Fifth Court ruling has tragically put people's lives at risk, and it's overturned some 30 years of protection that domestic violence survivors have been able to enjoy. It's dangerous. It puts people at risk. I can't imagine it's not going to endanger folks' lives and probably cost people their lives. This judge, this court, and the 52 Republican senators that voted to confirm this guy should be ashamed of themselves. Ashamed of themselves. How can you do that? How can you put people's lives at risk willy-nilly, such as what's happened in this ruling? I'm committed, as my colleagues here are, to make sure that we return these protections to the individuals across all of our districts who need them. This only applies in 3 states, but it is a terrible sign that we could be fighting this battle in other states to come. So thank you for including me, and I'm going to introduce, not here, Debbie Dingell from Michigan.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Lucy and Troy. Thank you for my colleagues for working on this issue so hard. I want to thank Congresswoman McBath for bringing us together here to talk about the importance of protecting survivors of domestic violence and the need to keep guns out of the hands of those that should not have them. The ruling, let me be really clear. The ruling out of the Fifth Circuit Court is extreme, it's dangerous, and quite frankly, as a survivor, a child survivor, it's unacceptable. The data on firearms and domestic abuse is clear. We know that perpetrators of violence use firearms to exert power and control over their victims. And access to a firearm increases the risk of an intimate partner homicide 5-fold. And when you're there, and that abuser loses his temper, or loses it, or whatever makes them act the way they do, and the gun is there, they will use it. And that is why people die. That's why protection orders are so important. They are the only survivor-led legal protection that a survivor can access. And I want to be really clear. Getting a protection order is not simple or easy. They require court adjudication based on evidence, where they are found by a court to pose a danger to the intimate partner or a child, which can often be, I can't tell you how many domestic survivors I work with who can't get that help that they need. To prove what they've got to do in the legal system. The legal system's tough. But we got a responsibility to ensure survivors have a legal avenue to defend themselves from future violence. And this ruling from the Fifth Circuit Court endangers that. By now, a lot of you know this is very personal for me. I grew up in a home with a man that shouldn't have had access to a gun. It gets really hard for me to talk about this every time because it just brings back the memories. And trust me, when I was a kid, thank you, Mike, he knows. When I was a kid, nobody gave a damn. I called the police, Father ripped the phone out of the wall, and nobody came. And then you go and you hide in that closet with your brothers and sisters, and you're sure that you're going to die. When you grab that gun from your father when he's about to shoot your mother, you don't know what it's like to live in that house with a gun until you've done it. I remember the terror. So I want to tell you, this court decision is so unacceptable. And I argue this first for every child who has to live in that situation. Every child. And for the women or men that are subject to that abuse. So I also want to say to you, there's a lot of misinformation spreading about this decision. So I want to set the record straight here too. First, the decision only applies to the Fifth Circuit, which includes Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. This does not impact the rest of the country. Those living outside of the Fifth Circuit who are subject to protection orders still are not allowed to have access to firearms. Second, this decision strikes down federal law prohibiting persons subject to protection orders from accessing firearms. Those convicted of domestic violence still must comply with federal law prohibiting access to firearms. And last, this decision didn't overturn any existing state laws. Now, it's, we're dealing with Texas and Louisiana. So their laws may not be, but they're there. And unfortunately, Mississippi does not have one. But they are, these persons subject to domestic violence protection orders, even in a state, so 2 of them within the Fifth Circuit's jurisdiction are not subject, or the state laws are there. Equally disturbing to the Fifth Circuit decision is the fact that dating partners subject to protection orders and convicted, legal, due process stalkers can still access firearms in what's known as the boyfriend loophole. You all know that's been one of my focuses since I got here. We've made progress. We're getting ready to, with my partner, Senator Amy Klobuchar, to reintroduce legislation on this effort. But I just want to say it's really simple. Perpetrators of domestic violence who have had due process, who have gone through a court system, should not have access to guns. Because when you do, something bad is going to happen. And I think I do you next.
All right.
Thank you. Troy Carter.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Congressman Troy Carter from the state of Louisiana, and very proud to stand with my colleagues today to talk about something we shouldn't have to talk about, to talk about something that shouldn't have happened. We know that the decision out of the Fifth Circuit is alarming for the abuse victims and will contribute to the gun violence epidemic in our country. It is well established that access to firearms increases the risk of domestic violence turning deadly. Allowing those with restraining orders to access firearms is a direct threat to the safety and well-being of survivors and their families. When domestic abusers are allowed to purchase guns, there are countless women, children, and survivors who will continue to live in fear. This ruling will bring violence, and my heart breaks for the agony that is sure to come. As a member of the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force, I will fight against this ruling. We must work to keep firearms out of the hands of people who pose threats to themselves and others, especially those with domestic violence history. We know that it's no secret that when a person has been the victim of domestic violence, they're often taken to a safe house. They often have their identities changed and they move. Why? Why? Because they're at risk. Because this individual has demonstrated the ability and the capacity to cause great harm. No one should have to live that way. People that have exhibited that level of behavior should not have access to a firearm. My friends, may I suggest that this is a step backwards. It's a step backwards. In my home state of Louisiana, we passed legislation to address this very issue, to now have the Fifth Circuit threaten it. And while this may be a piercing of the veil, it's a dangerous piercing of the veil for the other states in the Union that this may not have application for. Let today be a clarion call for our brothers and sisters all over the country that we are going to be vigilant, we're going to be mindful, and we're going to fight back, because no one deserves to have that level of fear to live with because of a once loved one who has turned into a very dangerous threat, has access to a weapon when they should not. It's very basic. We will not allow this to happen without our strong advocacy. We will stand with those victims here in Texas and throughout the country to make sure that our voices and our advocacy stands with you to protect your voice, your freedom, and your peace of mind. We stand with you, and we will not easily go away without making sure that these changes are protected and that these opportunities for violence to continue are stopped. God bless you, and thank you for being with us.
Well, at this time, I'd like to call on some of our amazing partners, both local and national, that have been doing the work. They have been in the trenches. They have been on the ground fighting gun violence all over the nation. At this time, I'd like to introduce to you NNEDV President and CEO Deborah J. Vagans for a few remarks.
Thank you. I'm Deborah Vagans, President and CEO of the National Network to End Domestic Violence, and we represent the 56 state and territorial domestic violence coalitions. I'm honored to be here today, invited by Congresswoman McBath, a tireless leader who knows firsthand the devastating effects of gun violence. And I want to thank her and the courageous members of Congress and the fellow advocates behind me today who are all working to end gun violence, and to the members of Congress who are sharing their, and survivors who are sharing their deeply intimate stories. That is a labor that they've been called into service to do in order to stop this scourge that we're seeing in front of us. Like the other speakers today, NNEDV condemns this Fifth Circuit ruling that struck down as unconstitutional 30 years of federal law prohibiting those under a protective order for domestic violence from possessing firearms. NNEDV is deeply concerned about the impact that this decision will have on domestic violence victims, their families, and community safety. It's simple. Domestic violence and firearms are a lethal combination. According to DOJ, nationwide, an average of 3 women are killed by a current or former partner every day. And research published by the National Library of Medicine found that when a male abuser has access to a firearm, the risk that he will shoot and kill a female partner increases by 1,000%. The decision flies in the face of common sense gun regulations and is completely devoid of both the lived experiences of survivors and any understanding about the connection between firearms and domestic violence homicides. Civil domestic violence protective orders provide life-saving protections by removing guns from the equation. Eliminating this protection shows an utter disregard for survivors' safety and will unnecessarily put thousands of victims in grave danger. While I cannot overemphasize this decision's callous disregard for survivor safety, it's also important for us to emphasize what Congresswoman Dingell was discussing. It's important to note what this decision does not do at this time so that survivors around the country understand the protections that are still available to them. The decision only strikes down federal law prohibiting people subject to civil domestic violence protective orders access to firearms. It does not strike down federal law prohibiting access to firearms from people convicted of domestic violence. The decision only applies in the Fifth Circuit, so that is Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana, and the decision does not overturn any state law, even in a state within the Fifth Circuit. The concern is that more action, more legislative action, more judicial action might take place to weaken protections around the country, and that is what we have to stop. Ending gun violence is critical to ending domestic violence, and NNEDV is working with our membership, other anti-violence organizations, our leaders in Congress, to educate the public and the media about the connection between firearms and domestic violence homicides, and we will continue to urge more progress on common sense gun laws to make all of us safer. Thank you very much.
And at this time, I'd like to introduce one of my colleagues, Representative Robin Kelly of Illinois, who has been tirelessly on the front lines for gun violence prevention and safer communities.
I'm proud to stand with so many of my courageous colleagues today, but the reason we are here is deeply, deeply painful. Yet again, the courts, as you've heard, have chosen a gun over human life. The courts have told the American people that your right to live a life free from the terror and violence of gunshots is less important than the continued proliferation of deadly weapons across the country. The Fifth Circuit has told victims of domestic violence that their lives are not worth protecting, even with simple common sense gun regulation. And the fact that victims of domestic violence are overwhelming women and women of color who are already disproportionately subject to violence is no coincidence. This is very personal to me. One of my great volunteers lost her life because her husband shot her in the head in front of their young son and then shot himself. And that same year, I lost my cousin to domestic violence. So this is very personal. Marginalized people, specifically Black people, are disproportionately victimized and traumatized by the epidemic of gun violence, and far too many leaders ignore the obvious. This slow motion massacre of Black and brown boys and girls and men and women is a public health crisis, and we need to start treating it like one. Just last night, I was joined by Annette Nance Holt at the State of the Union, who is still pleading with our leaders to take action over a decade after her son was shot and killed on a Chicago City bus coming home from school. In the last few years, we have witnessed reactionary right-wing courts strip away the fundamental rights we hold dear. From abortion rights to voting rights, the court has too often disregarded the rights we have fought for years to uphold. We cannot turn back the clock. We cannot go back. We must use the power of Congress to deliver what the American people want. We need stronger gun safety legislation because our constituents deserve to be safe no matter where they are. So many women affected by this decision may no longer feel safe, even in their own homes. There is no excuse. This must end and end now. Thank you, and thank you for listening.
At this time, we'd like to bring forth Everytown's Senior Vice President of Movement Building, Angela Farrell-Zabala. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for everyone here and the courageous members of Congress that are here and pulled this together today. So my name is Angela Farrell-Zabala, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Movement Building at Everytown for Gun Safety and Moms Demand Action. And I'm a mom who is demanding action to save lives from gun violence. Last week's decision by the extremist Fifth Circuit panel is incredibly dangerous and disturbing. If it's allowed to stand, it will be a death sentence for women, children, and families. This is just the most recent dangerous decision extremist judges have made regarding guns that put our communities and families at risk. Last year, the Supreme Court created chaos with its own reckless ruling in Bruin, inviting court challenges to our most important public safety laws, including the law that keeps guns out of the hands of domestic abusers with restraining orders. But even under the dangerous Bruin ruling, this landmark protection for women should be allowed to stand. This decision is putting a target on the victims of domestic abuse by empowering their abusers with easy access to guns. This decision, like I said, and the gun laws that protect victims of domestic abuse are among the most important public safety laws in the country. Very important. And make no mistake, prohibiting dangerous people from accessing deadly weapons, including those who have abused their partners or children and are placed under a restraining order, is absolutely consistent with both the Second Amendment and Bruin. This is not an abstract exercise. And in just the first few weeks of this year, as we've heard earlier, we've witnessed the deadly intersection of guns and domestic violence in communities across the country. In Utah, a man shot and killed his wife, mother-in-law, and 5 children 2 weeks after his wife filed for divorce. In North Carolina, a man shot and killed his wife and 3 children. In Michigan, a man shot and killed his long-term partner and her 2 daughters in response to her trying to leave him. And those are just a few examples of the heinous things that are happening. Access to guns makes it 5 times more likely that a woman will die at the hands of a domestic abuser. We stand strongly in opposition to this extreme and dangerous ruling. This is a reminder to everyone that elections have consequences. We must only elect leaders like those here with us today who will stand up for safety and oppose extremist judges who put our lives, our families, and our communities at risk. I'm proud to stand here today next to partners and legislators who will continue the fight to keep guns out of the hands of domestic abusers. Everytown and Moms Demand Action and Students Demand Action, all those gathered here today, we're going to be joining you and stay in partnership with you in calling for this ruling to be overturned immediately. And with that, I'll pass it off to Brady Counsel Shira Feldman.
Thank you so much, Angela. Good afternoon. My name is Shira Feldman. I'm litigation counsel at Brady, one of the nation's most long-standing, nonpartisan, nonprofit organizations dedicated to reducing gun violence. First, I want to thank Congresswoman McBath and the other members of Congress here today for speaking out about the dangers posed by this ruling and for inviting me to join them in doing so. Last Thursday, the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit took unprecedented action that may endanger the lives of countless men and women across the country. It decided that a person who is voluntarily the subject of a domestic violence restraining order is entitled to have guns, even though a court has determined that that person poses a threat to others. There is a particular relationship between domestic violence and gun violence in this country. Female intimate partners are more likely to be murdered with a gun than by all other means combined. The mere presence of a gun in an abusive relationship escalates the violence directed toward the victim. A male abuser's direct access to a gun increases by more than 1,100% the likelihood that intimate partner violence he commits will become fatal. And one study found that 41% of people who carried out a mass attack between 2016 and 2020 had a history of domestic violence. The Fifth Circuit's decision, if it stands, will do away with a critical government tool for addressing this tragic reality. And it will place thousands of people, in particular women, in immediate mortal danger. The Fifth Circuit made this decision by badly misapplying Supreme Court precedent and by disregarding the terrible consequences for domestic violence victims. In fact, the court refused to recognize protections for domestic violence victims as having anything to do with preserving social order. Instead, it insisted that because domestic violence was not recognized as a problem in 18th century America, a time when women were generally considered to be property, we can't protect victims today. That cannot be the law. The Fifth Circuit's decision was not required by the Second Amendment or by any Supreme Court decision. We expect that the Department of Justice will seek further review, and we are optimistic that this radical and dangerous decision will be reversed. But if it is not, there will be deadly consequences for thousands of people in America. Then I'd like to pass it off to David Puccino of Giffords.
Thank you very much to all of the members and my fellow advocates here today. I am David Puccino, the Deputy Chief Counsel of Giffords Law Center, which is the legal arm of the gun violence prevention organization founded by former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. I appreciate the opportunity to join you all in condemning this misguided and dangerous ruling. The Rahimi decision says that a person who a court has found represents a credible threat to the physical safety of an intimate partner or child must be allowed to have a gun. This means that in the 3 states affected by the decision, that's Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, more guns will be in the hands of people who should not have them. We know that that will mean more vulnerable people will suffer grave injury or death. We also know that a history of domestic violence is one of the highest risk factors for committing an act of mass violence. This flawed interpretation of the Supreme Court's Bruin ruling cannot stand. In the Bruin decision, as in Heller before it, the court said that its rulings applied to those who were law-abiding and responsible. As Justice Kavanaugh wrote in the Bruin concurrence, and as quoting Justice Scalia from back in Heller, he said that the Second Amendment is neither a regulatory straitjacket nor is it a regulatory blank check. Like most rights, it is not unlimited. It does not prevent us from protecting ourselves from those who would do us harm or who would do harm to our children. The Justice Department should petition the Supreme Court to review this decision without delay, and the court must clearly state that whatever Bruin means, it does not mean that we must give those who would do us harm or do harm to our children the deadly means to do so. I'd like to thank all of the members here for their unwavering leadership to address gun violence and for elevating this issue. Thank you.
And our last speaker for this afternoon is an absolute champion in Washington. Our colleague, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee from Texas, is the ranking member on the crime subcommittee for the Judiciary Committee. She has been on the front lines as a champion, really defending an opposition against crime and gun violence prevention all around the country. Sheila Jackson Lee.
Let me thank Congresswoman McBath, who has never wavered for bringing us together, who has a true personal story, and we'll never forget Jordan, to bring us together around the viciousness of gun violence. Thank you, Congressman Carter, for your presence, as well as the chair of the Gun Task Force, which I serve along with Congresswoman McBath as vice chair. I stand today in the name of victims. As we speak, someone in America is the victim of domestic violence with a gun. Not only is it a significant other, a girlfriend, a wife, a friend, a woman, it is a child. I stand in the name of police officers. One of my neighbors in Houston, Texas, Sergeant Preston, who lost his life going to rescue to a home of a domestic violence call, and he was able to save the wife and the son, but he lost his life. I stand in the name of Lila, age 21, whose spouse or significant other had a protection order and a gun, and was known for assault and violence, and he killed her and injured her one-year-old son. I say that to characterize how ludicrous the Fifth Circuit decision is, how lacking in timeliness, how insensitive, how awkward, and how inconsistent with the law. I authored the Violence Against Women Act, which had been dormant for 5 years. It had expired. One of the major elements of the Violence Against Women Act when it was first passed was what we call the boyfriend loophole, that would include the protection of women in the instance of any action that was taken against an individual who would do them harm, a misdemeanor or level of felon. And so even without such, if the person has a known history, it makes no sense for the Fifth Circuit to suggest that state law usurps federal law. The Violence Against Women's Act, passed into law, signed by the President, has a provision on the boyfriend loophole. And here we have a Fifth Circuit talking about that they don't know if it is constitutional. You are wrong, and your interpretation is wrong. As a resident of the state of Texas, we have open carry. I call that a birthday celebration for criminals. and individuals who will use guns to harm individuals. The most targeted victims are family members, whether it is mother and father, whether it is, again, a significant other, what is the innocent child that is in the midst of that family structure. And here we now have the Fifth Circuit putting ice cream on top of a dangerous situation. One might think it would be better to say that they're igniting an already burning fire. But I would suggest that the way they characterize the law, that they couldn't help themselves, that this was just simply unconstitutional, or they didn't know if they could impact these states. Have they ever heard of the idea of federal law usurping state law? Even with the 10th Amendment, it is to those things left to the states. And certainly we have understood that guns under the Second Amendment is a federal issue. And I remind everyone, in law school you learn that you cannot cry fire in a crowded theater. You cannot pour gasoline on an already disruptive situation with a person who is known to carry a gun and to use that gun violently. And so I am stunned and support the work that we're going to do on ensuring that we hope we'll find friends on both sides of the aisles to be able to ensure that we support the Department of Justice as they challenge this decision. This decision cannot spread among the circuits. It will be dangerous for women across America and other victims of domestic violence across America. Shame on the Fifth Circuit for exposing people to death, exposing people to injury, exposing people to helplessness in their own home. Lila was 21 years old in her home, and the use of that gun from a familiar person would have been affirmed and congratulated by the Fifth Circuit. We can't do anything. It is the law. Congresswoman McBath, it is not the law. It is not right. It is not humane. It is not with the dignity of preserving life. And I don't believe under the Constitution it will withstand the challenge. It should not by the U.S. Department of Justice. We will be supporting that effort and looking for other ways to protect women and police officers across America. The most dangerous call an officer can make is a domestic violence call, and particularly when those engaged, the perpetrator, is loaded with arms without restraint. And so, with emotion, I look forward to us winning this battle in order to save lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee. Your words could not ring more truer. And thank you for everyone that stands with me today. Thank you for sharing your stories, because the stories matter. The stories are what move people to act. The stories are what move my colleagues in Washington and state legislatures all around the country to act. Thank you for sharing your stories and putting this into perspective. Before we get to any questions, I want to take a moment to reflect on the very real and deeply troubling reality that this decision has created. Laws which are designed to protect victims of domestic violence are utterly under attack. Laws designed to protect Americans from gun violence are under attack. And no survivor anywhere in this country deserves to live in fear of their abuser, who's already caused so much harm in his or her life, has unfettered access to weapons. Thank you all very much for taking your time to come and listen to our stories and our plea for the Fifth Circuit Court to do the right thing. And with that, we open up for any questions.
Ma'am, I'm curious, as you know,